And with that, Chris Lucasina, our director, will go ahead and get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you all are doing well. Like Shelby said, if you have any questions along the way, the chat in the WebEx is a great way to get it going. And I think at a couple of points here, we'll open it up for you know, sort of global responses to some of those questions. So, Bonnie, if you can click back into the PowerPoint there, I think it'll let me advance here. There we go. All right, so hopefully today you'll get a better understanding of what the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization is, a little bit of a history and the context of what we do, what transportation planning requirements are, who the various different partners and funding sources are. We'll talk specifically about Wake Transit, as well as a few other of the more major programs that we have here at the MPO. And we'll hopefully be able to make this all relevant and relatable to you and what your communities are trying to do on a regular basis. You'll see a couple of icons as we go throughout the presentation today. The yellow one with the sort of laptop looking thing will tell you that there is a web resource, and it's generally going to be a URL that you'll be able to have and use later on. And then the other one there with all those folks kind of holding the trampoline puzzle looking thing, that is where you have an opportunity for involvement of some kind. It could be public involvement, it could be stakeholder involvement, it could be involvement through a committee, a variety of different things. And we'll talk about each of those as we go through. So at the dawn of MPO time, across the country, and the dawn of MPO time is really in the 1960s, which was about 10 years after the federal government passed the first, Highway Aid Act or Federal Aid Act that included interstates. You had a lot of folks at the state level and at the local level who wanted and needed transportation improvements, all different kinds. And so very quickly they realized that they needed to do something to kind of corral all that and get it organized. And so at the state level in 1959, the General established thoroughfare plans, and some of you who have been involved in transportation long enough understand what that is. That was really a highway or roadway master plan for each community. Those were adopted by the local government and the state through the North Carolina Department of Transportation and specifically the Board of Transportation. In 1962, some federal laws were established that required a continuing, cooperative, and comprehensive, or 3C, transportation planning process. In order to do that, they established Metropolitan Planning Organizations, MPOs. Those were for all urbanized areas, according to the U.S. Census, with a population in excess of 50,000, and they were a requirement to be able to receive federal transportation funding. So through the 60s and into the 70s, the Charlie Brown picture there kind of illustrates what MPOs kind of look like in terms of their capabilities and really their responsibilities. And, by the 2000s and beyond, you kind of had a very different looking Christmas tree with a lot more responsibility, a lot more requirements to be able to use those federal transportation funds or build those major projects regardless of the funding source. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but if you are very interested in the history of legislation related to MPOs, here is a quick reference guide for you. I think the key thing to take away from this slide here is that since the 1990s, starting in 1991 with what was called ICE-T, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, which was the federal transportation legislation that maintained the Highway Trust Fund, which is the actual funding mechanism for most transportation dollars from the federal government that flow into the state. And all the way through the 90s and 2000s, subsequent legislation has been passed at the federal and the state levels related to making sure that folks were working cooperatively and had a plan, and then were implementing those plans when it came to transportation. The most recent legislations are there in yellow at the bottom. MAP 21, which was passed in 2012, and then a couple years later, the FAST Act, the Fixing American Surface Transportation Act. That is the current federal legislation that transportation planning and operations are functioning under. And these two were important because the MAP 21 started it, and the FAST Act kind of continued some major changes to how MPOs needed to do what they were doing, and the states for that matter, to recognize that money that was being used, particularly federal dollars that are used, had to, do things that had an impact, and hopefully a positive impact. And so the old way of doing things prior to that, where you would, identify your needs, you'd plan for them, you'd go build them, you didn't really do that anymore. Now you had to kind of go back and look at how effective are you how effective are your plans at meeting your needs? And that brought us into the world of performance measures and targets. And so how do we do all that? We do that through the Metropolitan Planning Organization. As I've already said, it's federally mandated, and our operations are federally funded. We are the transportation policy-making organization and decision makers for, at a minimum, those federal transportation dollars for our region. The MPO is made up of representatives from local governments and other governmental transportation authorities, as well as representatives from the state and advisory representatives from the federal level. We are the key component and the forum to ensure that the 3C planning process happens. Again, that's continuing, cooperative, and comprehensive. And yes, in federal legislation and federal regulations, there is a specific definition for each of those 3 Cs. And it's not exactly what you would think if you looked it up in the dictionary. It's a little bit different. So, as we already said, MPOs were created at a minimum in urbanized areas with a population of 50,000 or more. Every 10 years after each federal census, MPOs are required to review their boundaries and modify their boundaries to ensure that they keep the full urbanized area within the boundaries of an MPO. But then we're also required to look at what areas are likely or might urbanize over the next 20 years. And so we add to our boundary area those areas that look like they would likely urbanize over the next 20 years. So this year and next month, actually, we'll be going through the 2020 census. And after the results of that are tallied and released, we will go through an exercise to review our MPO boundary. If the urbanized area has gone outside of our boundary, we will be required to adjust the boundary to include it. And then we'll also do an analysis of those areas that look like they would likely urbanize even beyond the urbanized area and look to include those as well. Outside of those two things, we have a little more discretion about whether we would add to the boundary or not. So after the 2010 census, we had to do a slight adjustment in the Clayton, North Carolina area because they are part of the urbanized area and they had expanded out a little bit outside of our MPO boundary, so we adjusted the boundary there. That is the only boundary adjustment we made in 2010. So we did not, change the boundary other than to incorporate that minimum requirement. I think we had invitations out to, and help me, Shelby, if I forget anything, Butner, the town of Butner, the town of Lewisburg, and we had conversations with Smithfield and Selma, and all three had opted not to join, and so we moved on and continued to work with them and the RPOs, the rural planning organizations outside of our boundary, to make sure we have some sort of coordination going on. So this map here just kind of shows you in the blues and greens and purples on that map, you can see where we have urbanized area in our region. And then the lighter gray with the sort of, hopefully it's orange color on your screen. If not, it's probably yellow. Shows you our MPO boundary. And then you'll see sort of a red or maroon bounded area to our northwest. That is the Durham-Chapel Hill-Carborough MPO. So in the Greater Triangle area, there are actually 2 MPOs established and that work together, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you can see in Johnston County where sorry everyone, I just hit the laser pointer and realized none of you can see the laser pointer. One learning curve here we have with webinars, no laser pointers in the room, right? But you can see in the Clayton area in Johnston County, sort of to the bottom right of the screen that you're seeing on the map, where our boundary kind of curves back to the west a little bit. That would be the area where we think there would be a possibility that the urbanized area might expand kind of down the US 70 business corridor. And so, you know, we'll be looking at that when the 2020 census results are completed and released. So each MPO was established with these 5 core functions. Establishing a fair and impartial setting for the 3C planning process, developing and evaluating transportation alternatives to meet what we believe our future needs are. To develop and maintain a regional transportation plan known as the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, to develop a transportation improvement program, also known as the TIP, and that is our regional equivalent of the state TIP or STIP that some of you are probably a little more familiar with. I will say in North Carolina, the term TIP and STIP tend to get used and get mixed and used interchangeably, but they are 2 distinct things. And then the 5th one on there is involving the public, and that would be in particular residents and stakeholders and key affected subgroups. And so these 5 areas are what are known as the MPO core functions. And a little bit later, we'll talk about our annual work program. It is divided up by core and non-core functions. And so obviously we focus on those core functions, and as we have resources available in any given year, we may do some things that are considered non-core function, but still related to what we do. So in those 2 documents that we are required to create and maintain, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and the Transportation Improvement Program, there are lots and lots of rules and regulations we have to follow as we develop those. But at a minimum, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, also called MTP, it must be developed and go and look out at least 20 years, and we are required to update that every 4 years. It will also have a list of all of the anticipated revenues and costs for projects. And we are required to have a fiscally constrained Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So we can't include a project that we don't show reasonably expected funding for. The Transportation Improvement Program, again, this is the regional equivalent of the state TIP. For those of you who aren't familiar even with that, think of a capital improvement program that only includes transportation projects and programs. This is, for us, that's at a regional level. So in ours, it identifies state, federal, and local funding for projects and programs. And the things that are in that transportation improvement program, the projects and programs, must be included within our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. If they are not in the MTP, they cannot be included in the TIP, which means they cannot get funding. Then the third thing on there, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. These are air quality requirements that are across the country, and they establish that we have an air quality, a level for air quality that must be met and maintained. And federal funding can be withheld if the projects that are included in our plan and the TIP do not help maintain or meet those air quality standards. This is a pretty important thing, and it's a pretty big effort, and it takes some time. And so as a result of this, changing our plan is not something that you might see done as nearly as much as you might have comprehensive plan amendments at the local level done, which can happen maybe several times a year or even monthly. Changing the MTP is a much bigger lift and requires a lot of coordination and review by multiple state and federal agencies to ensure that the changes will continue to meet air quality standards. So specifically for CAMPO, what you see here up on the screen now is our existing CAMPO boundary. So everything included in the light gray area is within the CAMPO boundary. We include all of Wake County, parts of Granville, Franklin, Johnston, and Harnett counties. That's 19 municipal jurisdictions and, of course, the 5 counties. Our population for the MPO area is about 12% of North Carolina's population. So we're a little over 1.25 million people within the MPO. And you can learn more about those fun facts at your very first web resource, the CAMPO website, campo-nc.us. And yes, we had to put the NC in there because, believe it or not, there's more than one CAMPO out there in the country. There are other MPOs in capital areas in other states that also use the CAMPO acronym. So just remember the campo-nc.us and it'll take you to our website. So our MPO structure, at the top, it's the executive board. So that is made up of the local elected officials as well as members from the North Carolina Board of Transportation, a transit designee that currently is one of the board members for Go Triangle, and this is the decision-making body for the MPO. Only decisions that have been delegated through delegated authority from the executive board can be made by others for the MPO. The MPO also has a technical committee made up of staff members, generally staff members from the various local governments that are members of the MPO, as well as state agencies and some federal agencies, and that's known as the Technical Coordinating Committee. There's a full-time professional staff here for the MPO, and then, of course, the members of the executive board and the TCC are that conduit to the local governments and other agencies that are members of the MPO, particularly at their council levels and other committees. So our executive board, again, is the policy and decision-making body. In other MPOs, it's known as a TAC, or Transportation Advisory Committee. Our board felt very strongly after the 2010 census that they are not an advisory group. They are a decision-making body, and so they wanted to be called the executive board and formally changed their name then. But in other MPOs across the state, some of them still go by TAC. And several times a year, you'll hear someone from, say, the North Carolina Department of Transportation talk about, oh, your TAC. What they mean for CAMPO is the executive board. This board meets monthly on the third Wednesday of the month at 4 p.m. at the CAMPO offices. These are open public meetings, and whether you're on the board or not, you are always welcome to attend. For the Technical Coordinating Committee, again, that staff level technical committee that makes recommendations to the executive board on matters that go before the TCC. They meet the first Thursday of each month at 10 a.m. Those are also open meetings, and anyone is welcome to attend. For a list of current members of either of these two boards and committees, you can go to our website, specifically under the About Us tab for Executive Board or TCC. That's also where you can see a copy of the bylaws for each group. And I think that's what, we don't have anything other fun facts that we have on that link. No, I don't think so. The important things, the roster and the bylaws will get you started. As you're looking through anything on our website, if you all have questions or you want to talk in more detail or more depth about anything, please feel free to contact us. We can set up a time to come sit down with you, or if you want even presentations done to your local council, we'll be happy to do that. The MPO staff here, we have 16 full-time staff members and 1 part-time member currently. You can see the list there of the different positions we have. We have transportation planners and modelers, the transportation engineer modelers. Those are folks who work with our computer forecasting models to look out into the future and help determine what our needs are, where our deficiencies are, and how to address those. We have 3 full-time staff members that are dedicated to implementing and maintaining the Wake Transit program. We'll talk a little bit more about that later today. But again, you can see sort of the wide range of positions we have to help meet the needs of that 3C transportation planning process. And again, you can see everyone on the staff on our website under the About Us and Staff link. So our partners. There are lots of folks involved in this process. You all that are elected officials or appointed officials, state agencies, other regional agencies. We work a lot with our sister MPO on the western side of the triangle, the Durham Tropical Carborough MPO, surrounding RPOs, as I mentioned earlier. We also work with Go Triangle and the other transit operators, and with various federal agencies. Obviously, we work a lot with the U.S. Department of Transportation, but also with the Environmental Protection Agency, Fish and Wildlife, and a lot of other partners to help implement the projects that are in our plan. We work with the private sector, the business community, and of course, most importantly, with the public in developing our plans and programs and then moving forward to implement them. You all, by definition, are not just members of our MPO, but you're also our partners. The needs you identify at the local level, part of what we do is then stitch those together across the region with the other needs that have been identified with all of the other local governments and communities in our region into one cohesive regional plan that then we try to implement. So, again, the executive board member for your community, if that is you, you are that lead conduit at the decision maker level for your community. That's, you think of yourself as not only a voting member at the MPO and at your local board, but you're also that liaison, so you can distribute information back and forth, you can coordinate between the two, and you can provide information to us from that local level as well. And your TCC members, your staff members that are involved in the MPO do that too. You will also be asked from time to time when we're doing corridor studies or area-wide studies to identify future transportation needs to serve on the various stakeholder groups and committees that are involved in the development of those studies and plans. We have jointly adopted regional transportation policy priorities. This was done by our MPO and the Durham Tropical Carborough MPO. These are available on our website, and we can also email them to anyone who's interested. These are fairly high level, I will say, but they do have some more discrete, actionable to-dos for each one. We tried to fit this on one page, front and back. And then each one of those items down there, like the blue, invest for success, or the green, make investments reliable and predictable, each one of those we have far more information about each one of those. But this is meant to be sort of a one-pager that you all can have and use as you work through what we do and how we do, and in particular, when you all as elected officials are meeting with your legislative delegations to have more information for transportation when you have those conversations. So some of our agency level partners in the region, the Durham Chapel Carrboro MPO, also known as the DCHC MPO. At the staff level, we work with them on a very regular basis. We have joint technical staff meetings to ensure the development of a unified transportation plan for the region. Although it's adopted separately by each MPO, it is developed in close coordination with each other. We also work very closely with the Triangle J Council of Governments for a variety of different things, including the coordination of our air quality program between the two MPOs. On the map you see there, it is a very busy map, and that's by design to show that on the one hand you have the counties in the white, you have the MPO boundaries in the purple, and you have the air quality boundary in the red. So, or our forecasting area in the red. So you can see that there are a lot of overlapping boundaries. Almost all of them are imaginary lines on a map, and it takes a lot of coordination to make things happen. So why do we work so closely with the Triangle J Council of Governments and with the DCHC MPO, as well as our surrounding RPOs? It's because when you look at our commuting patterns, we have some pretty unique commuting patterns. If you look at the Charlotte region, you have you have very much a morning inflow into Mecklenburg County, and then in the afternoon everybody leaves and goes back to their other counties and communities. Here in the Triangle, you have a lot of folks in the AM and the PM that kind of go everywhere. There's a huge commute pattern in between Wake and Durham counties, and it's not all going to RTP in the morning and all coming back in the afternoon. There is a lot of back and forth throughout the day. So it's very much a different kind of commuter pattern than in even the other large metropolitan area in our state. So the Triangle J Council of Governments, they're the regional COG for this area. They help with and coordinate between the two MPOs during the development of our regional plan. They are also the home to our regional travel demand management program. That's the program that does things like helps to coordinate van pooling and carpooling programs, the smart commuter program that maybe you've seen throughout media, or even if at local coffee shops, the wrap that you get on your coffee cup has advertising for that. But these are programs and projects that are designed to help try and reduce the amount of single occupancy vehicle trips throughout our region, and has been one of the more successful programs in the state. They also help coordinate across a very wide spectrum of other regional issues that are all related to transportation in some form or fashion, whether that be housing, land use, water quality, even to some degree recreation, parks and recreation activities. And Bonnie, I'm just going through these. I don't know if there's been a significant level of questions being in the chat or not. So if there are, before I move on to the next topic in each area, just flag me down and we'll try and answer them.
Okay, we're good so far.
Okay, so one of our other important partners, and it's actually several, are the RPOs, the Rural Transportation Planning Organizations. These are kind of like MPOs, but for the non-urbanized parts of the state. In 1998, federal law started requiring what was called rural consultation. And in the early 2000s, actually I think it was in 1999, North Carolina, under state law, created these RPOs. And they are modeled a lot like MPOs. They don't have some of the same responsibilities, but their structure is very much the same. They have a policy board generally known as a TAC, and then they have those TCCs that are the staff level technical committees. They work with NCDOT to plan out the transportation systems and advise on transportation policy in the rural areas of our state. Although you will, when you look at the RPOs, find a few that kind of scratch your head a little bit and make you wonder about the definition of rural. The city of Wilson, North Carolina, is in an RPO. They are just under the 50,000 population requirement to be an MPO. And so they are probably one of the most, air quote, urbanized RPOs in the state. So there are a few, I guess, exceptions to the rule there, if you will, but the point is there is a regional level coordinating group in almost every corner of the state in transportation. In green on the screen there, you can see our neighboring RPOs, the Curtar RPO, the Triangle Area, the Upper Coastal Plain, and the Mid-Carolina RPOs. The Triangle Area RPO is actually housed at the Triangle J Council of Governments, and so that makes it really easy to coordinate with them. With our other partners, we reach out and work with them on a variety of issues, whether it's planning near the borders of those organizations, or even when it comes to coordinating what projects are being submitted to the statewide prioritization system. And we'll talk more about what that is a little later today. But the point here is that there are a lot of folks that we work with to ensure a seamless transportation system in the region. NCDOT is another major partner. And they are not, while they are one state agency, there are many, many, many different units and groups within the North Carolina Department of Transportation that we work with directly, whether it's the Transportation Planning Division, the geographic divisions, primarily divisions 4, 5, and 6 for our MPO. Our MPO spans all three of those NCDOT divisions. And so we work with all three of those division engineers on a regular basis. The statewide prioritization and programming units, all the different modal divisions, also the project development units, those are the groups inside the Department of Transportation that are responsible for designing and permitting the various transportation projects that are planned out and funded. And then the North Carolina Tolling Authority. Our region was the first region to vote to toll itself with the western pieces of the NC 540 corridor. And as a result, we have probably one of the longest histories of coordination with the North Carolina Toll Authority. NCDOT is a very big organization. Obviously, they span the state, but they are responsible for maintaining over 80,000 miles of public roads. That's the second largest public road system maintained by a state in the country, behind only Texas. And there were a few years, about 10 years ago, where we actually had more roadway mileage than even the state maintained road miles than even Texas did, but they surpassed us again. All North Carolina counties do not maintain public roads. There are other states where that's the case, but in many other states, the counties do maintain roadways. That's one of the reasons why North Carolina has such a large state-maintained road network. North Carolina is divided up into 14 geographic divisions, and they distribute federal funds that come to the state and to each MPO for our planning and operating activities, and they use our plans that are developed to determine what projects in our area are going to be funded in the state transportation improvement program. Here's a map just showing you how the state is divided up into the various geographic divisions. Again, Campo is in parts of divisions 4, 5, and 6. And so there's a variety of activities that involve all 3 of those divisions in almost everything that we do. Just to give you a little bit broader picture, this is always a fun map because it's lots of colors and lots of things, but I think the key thing to look at here and understand is that every corner of the state is covered by a metropolitan planning organization or a rural planning organization. And we're there kind of in the middle. It's like a brownish color, but again, you can see on all sides of our MPO, we have an MPO or another MPO or RPO that we are working with. At the federal level, we in the Department of Transportation, there are primarily 2 administrations that we work with: Federal Transit Administration and the Federal Highway Administration. The Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, they are responsible for coordinating and managing over the public transportation systems within the country. So that includes things like buses, subway systems, light rail systems, commuter rail, even passenger ferries and trolleys. They're also responsible for overseeing the demand response systems and the rural public transit systems. Through the FTA, the federal government provides financial assistance and funding for transit systems. That can be done through a variety of annual allocations, and you can see on the screen there the various program names. They're all named after sections of laws, so there's things like Section 5303 funding, 5307 funding, and so on. They also oversee a variety of federal competitive transportation grants once the projects have been selected. So, for example, when Go Raleigh, the transit provider within the city of Raleigh, received build grant funding, and before that, Tiger grant funding. Those were competitive federal transportation grant programs. Those funds were then overseen and administered by the FTA so that they could use those funds. The other main part of the U.S. Department of Transportation we deal with is the Federal Highway Administration. Federal Highway Administration oversees funds that are allocated to us, to the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and they oversee a lot of the rest of the surface transportation program outside of the public transit and rail. So they oversee the highways, the roadways, and even the bicycle and pedestrian modes. They are also designated as the prime agency within USDOT that oversees the work of the MPOs around the country. So every 4 years, we go through a certification review process that is led by the Federal Highway Administration. That's where they come in and kind of conduct an overall audit of what we do and how we do it to ensure that we're meeting all of the requirements that are out there. They provide technical assistance, they do project reviews, and of course our funding, most of our funding flows through the Federal Highway Administration to us and to the state. So the funding that we use for our operations and our planning activities here at the MPO, there's primarily 3 different flavors of funding, federal funding. What's known as PL funding, and these are our planning funds. There's also Surface Transportation Block Grant Program Direct Allocation Funding, which we use some of that funding that's allocated to us through that program for our operations, and the large majority of that money is used in our locally administered projects program. And that's sort of the funding program that we offer at our regional level to you all through a competitive process to fund small projects like sidewalks, greenways, intersection improvements, small widenings of roads, that sort of thing. The SPR funding, that's state planning and research funds, those are funds that are provided from the federal government to the state, to NCDOT, and they can use those for planning activities throughout the state. Historically, we have partnered with NCDOT on a variety of studies and planning activities, and when we do that and they're a funding partner, they have historically used the SPR funds for their share of the funding. Bonnie, did you put in here where we were taking short breaks, or are you just expecting me to?
There's breaks.
Okay, good. I'll keep going. No, I'm fine. I didn't know with the changes we made for the WebEx whether or not I was supposed to actually decide when to stop or not. But all right, so let's talk about some of the various planning requirements that we have as a region and that the MPO is charged with fulfilling. Across the country, there are a little over 400 MPOs. New York City has an MPO. Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, all those major cities have MPOs. And then even smaller communities like Greenville and Goldsboro, North Carolina have MPOs. So there's a very broad spectrum of size of MPO. And the larger MPOs, those with a population over 200,000 in their urbanized area, are known as Transportation Management Areas, or TMAs, and they have access to additional funding that the smaller MPOs do not, but we also have a greater level of responsibility, and particularly with things like congestion management and the level and the degree to which and the sophistication to which we have to meet our various requirements. So one of the big requirements that we have is air quality conformity, and that is the process by which we ensure that the projects and the investments we want to make in our transportation system will help us either improve air quality or maintain the required level of air quality. So in the Triangle region, the two MPOs, Capital Area MPO, CAMPO, and the DCHC MPO, in the early 2000s, recognized that because they were both part of one air quality analysis region, they had to start working together to make things happen and to meet the air quality requirements. So in 2002, they began synchronizing the updates to the regional plans. Back then, the MTP was known as the LRTP. So for all of you that are truly new to this, and you're still bewildered by the number of acronyms that we have in transportation, they also like to change the acronyms for things in transportation fairly often. So you'll note a few of those throughout this presentation, I'm sure. But what were called LRTPs and now are called MTPs, regional plans, we first started coordinating those activities with our sister MPO in 2002. By 2009, the two MPOs were developing a fully joint regional plan that was then mutually adopted by the two MPOs separately. The first time that happened was in 2009, and as a result of that effort, we actually won a national award for outstanding achievement in transportation planning. Our regional plan, since that time, we've had two more updates. So we've done 3 regional plans that were jointly created and are jointly maintained. Continues to be recognized at a national level as a best practice. Our most recent plan, the current plan of record, known as the 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan, was adopted by this MPO in February of 2018. And then based on some additional amendments to that and the required air quality conformity determination, we have our most recent updated adoption was in January of 2019. Our MTP planning effort it is on a 4-year cycle, and it's not like we adopt a plan and then put it away and we wait 4 years and then we start updating the plan. It's a continuous update cycle. So the day after we've adopted a plan update, we begin working on the next update that's due 4 years later. The federal consultation requirements, one of those C's that we talked about in the 3C process, actually says that the MPOs and the various states will consult with each other for things, for the various, and with local agencies that are responsible for land use decision-making, natural resource, overseeing of natural resources, environmental protections, and then conservation and historic preservation. We work with all of those agencies, including agencies, when we develop those long-range plans. We are required to have and maintain a system of performance measures that we can then measure and demonstrate how we are meeting the established regional goals and objectives that we have, as well as the targets for performance measures that have been set at the state and regional level across a variety of different areas. So in those two federal legislations that I mentioned a little while ago, MAP 21, that is where performance measures became a real sort of requirement for the MPOs. Prior to that, several MPOs around the country had performance measures, but they were essentially voluntary, right? There wasn't a requirement to have them. Now there is. Under MAP 21, the federal government identified specific areas that those performance measures were identified in. Everything from infrastructure condition and congestion reduction to safety, environmental sustainability, system reliability, all of those you can see up on the screen there. And they created the requirement for targets that were to be determined by the MPOs and by each state. A few years later, when the FAST Act was passed, it continued that approach of performance-based planning that was initially established under that MAP 21 law. It does require intermodal transportation planning. Specifically, it also identified that you had to include bicycle and pedestrian planning, that you recognize the Safe Routes to School program, and that you would also look at recreational trails. All of those things we were already doing actually prior to MAP 21 at this MPO, but it was now a national requirement. It also increased focusing on system reliability and resiliency, and trying to enhance travel and tourism. And I think that was one of the first times travel and tourism was identified as a transportation need and function. For transit planning, we were also in the FAST Act. It was the first time it mandated that intercity buses be considered when we're talking and looking at congestion reduction and system reliability and travel time reliability. And it wants us to look at energy consumption and pollution in cost-effective manners. We have specific targets that have been adopted by this MPO and are updated on a regular basis, reviewed and updated on a regular basis in several areas: safety, transit asset management, pavement condition, and congestion. Those targets are set on and updated on a regular basis, and a schedule that's mandated in federal regulation. So for example, those of you who are on our executive board, you know that last month we renewed those safety targets. And now it's break time. So what kind of break are we looking at?
We are looking at a 15-minute break. Say go.
Okay, so when I say go, you all have 15 minutes to do whatever you like. We'll start back up in 15 minutes. Go. Various forecast runs that we've done that show you forecasted based on real observations from 2013, and then on the right side, and and Bonnie, I'm noticing that the break timer didn't start yet.
It is. It's just a minute, every minute.
Okay, never mind.
There you go.
Oh, wow.
Thank you.
There you go. Okay.
Okay, folks, we're going to mute here.
For you if you're sitting in the room with us. To be clear, we did not have snacks and coffee here in your absence. So moving on, we're going to get into a little bit of the work that the MPO actually does. We're calling this section our functions, programs, and products. So as Chris talked about in the last section, we have a couple of documents that the MPO is required through federal law to keep up. That is the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or the MTP, the Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP, and then to get those done, we have an annual work program called our Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP. Part of our MTP also includes what we call our Comprehensive Transportation Plan, or CTP, which is a state-required document, and it is a more visionary element to our MTP. While the MTP must be fiscally constrained, meaning we can prove that we have enough revenues coming in to be able to fund the projects that we intend to deliver in that part of the plan, the Comprehensive Transportation Plan is more visionary and is not cost constrained. So you'll see the CTP projects on our MTP map, and we're assuming that those CTP projects would come into play after the last horizon year of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, so at this point after 2045. Chris talked a little about our Transportation Improvement Program. That is updated every couple of years. That's what we do through the SPOT process, which we're going to get into in a little more detail here in a few minutes. And then the UPWP is our annual work program and budget. We update this and adopt a new UPWP every year. The Executive Board just adopted ours for FY21 in February. So we do that obviously a little bit before local budgets are adopted and before, well before the start of the fiscal year, which that document is covering. But that's in order to allow our participant member governments to be able to plug their member shares into their local budgets. And also there's several transit funding sources that are included in the UPWP that need to have a federal process that they have to go through much earlier than seems, you know, reasonable. But we have to do that pretty early so that we can get all those ducks in a row and be able to begin work on the UPWP at the start of the fiscal year. So just a little visual for you that the CTP, again, is our not fiscally constrained planning document. That's more of our vision plan. Our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or MTP, goes out about 25 years to 30 years, and we plan that in 10-year horizons. So we have projects now in the 2025, 2035, and 2045 horizon years. What that means is that we're anticipating those projects, for instance, in the 2025 year, to be delivered prior to 2025. It doesn't mean everything's going to get built in 2025. It means it's going to get built by 2025. And so the same with 2035. The 2035 projects will be delivered sometime between 2026 and 2035. And again, that TIP is, as Chris mentioned earlier, sort of the capital improvement program that outlines the delivery of the MTP projects. This is another way of looking at that same information. So our CTP, again, is required by the North Carolina DOT. The North Carolina DOT did just develop some new CTP mapping styles that you'll see our CTP map converted into here shortly. This will be the same exact information that's already in our adopted MTP. It will just be displayed a little differently in the maps that are required for state planning purposes. And again, that CTP is a more comprehensive vision plan that goes beyond the fiscal constraints that are in our MTP. The CTPs for the counties that are only partially in CAMPO are done for those entire counties. For example, the Franklin County CTP is done for the entirety of Franklin County, and then the portion of Franklin County that's within CAMPO gets adopted into our MTP as a portion of our MTP. Our MTP, again, is that fiscally constrained or fiscally realistic plan. It's, again, federally mandated, and we have an emphasis in there on preserving our system and making sure our system is running efficiently. By our system, I mean our transportation system, our transportation network. It is updated every 4 years. As Chris mentioned earlier, we're constantly working on the next MTP. Sometimes we're working more strenuously on it as the deadline gets closer for that update, but all the time, all the things that we do, all the planning work that we do is leading up into being adopted into the MTP, which is that 25-year vision for our region's transportation future. The MTP also has extensive public involvement included with it. We do a lot of in-depth public engagement with some of our planning studies that lead into the MTP, but we do also separately have the more broad MTP level public involvement. So we're beginning to think about what that's going to look like for the 2050 MTP here in the next few months. And as Chris mentioned before, we do have a joint MTP with the Durham Chapel Hill Carborough MPO, And this latest MTP that we're operating under right now was adopted in February of 2018. So we're about 2 years into that 4-year cycle. This is just kind of a depiction of the planning process. It follows a general planning process that relies on the basis and foundation of planning principles. We look at the existing condition data that's in effect. We use our model to forecast some of the future problems we might have. We work with the public and our board and our TCC members to develop our vision and goals. I should also mention here that we don't do this from like a clean slate every year. We do recognize that we have an ongoing MTP that we are updating. So sometimes those updates are larger than others. You know, one time we had a pretty extensive bicycle and pedestrian element update that kind of changed how that product was delivered through the MTP. But by and large, we like to do more of a check-in. Are our vision and goals that we have for the region still the same? Are they shifting? Do we need to add on to them? Do we need to change those in any way as we get into the MTP update process? We go through all of the analysis and evaluation that you would expect. We work with our local governments to make sure that any local planning work that has been done that needs to be incorporated into the MTP, we make sure and incorporate that as much as we can or as much as necessary, including land use planning that goes into the foundations of our community viz model, which is a piece of our travel demand model that tells us when trips will be made, how they will be made, what mode they will be made by, and help us to determine what those recommendations in our final MTP are going to be. And then, of course, we have implementation strategy, which outlines all the phasing of projects, how they're going to be financed, who's going to deliver them, and how they're going to be delivered. As I mentioned, we have a lot of planning activities that are underway from year to year that go into that MTP update. These are constantly evolving. We have several large area studies that we do. We're currently starting on the update to the Northeast area study that just kicked off earlier this month. That's the kind of pie piece of our planning area between the 64 East corridor and the US 1 North corridor. So kind of that Wake Forest up to Franklinton and then down around to Wendell, Zebulon, Knightdale area. So that whole area is being evaluated more closely in order to update that portion of our MTP. And once that study is complete, the findings from that will be incorporated into our MTP update. We also do individual corridor studies where, you know, we have problems on corridors or issues that have been identified that we need a closer look at evaluating. Recent ones that we've done are the NC 98 corridor across the northern portion of our planning area, as well as NC 56 up there across the northern portion of our planning area. We have extensive studies done on US 1 corridor north, also NC 50, and we're about to begin a US 401 corridor study to the south in fiscal year 2021. That corridor study will go generally from 540 down through our planning area in Harnett County. We have done things called hotspot studies in the past, which are looking at individual sort of focus areas, if you will. So the ones we have as an example on the screen are the Crossroads interchange, the US 64, US 1 I-40 interchange there. We did a hotspot study in that area to look at a variety of interchange concepts and alignments to see what would work, what would fit, and what would serve the traffic best. And we did a similar exercise on the 50, 56, 15 intersection in Creedmoor. That intersection actually has been built now. It was funded through NCDOT and built, and I believe the Crossroads interchange also is funded through the SPOT process and is under design now as well. So those hotspot studies were more kind of pressing issues that needed some additional work on them in order to bring forward a more feasible implementation strategy. We do other special studies. We're about to start a regional bus on shoulder system study in the next fiscal year. We'll do that in concert with NCDOT and Go Triangle and the Durham-Chapel Hill-Carborough MPO to look at what corridors in our planning area would be suitable for bus on shoulder treatments. We have done things like the Raleigh-Cary rail crossing study. That was one of the non-core studies that Chris mentioned. It was really looking at securing that rail corridor between Raleigh and Cary, between kind of West Raleigh and East Cary, to see what the road network needed to look around there, and do a little station area conjecturing as well. We did a study, another non-core study with Rollsville to look at their main street, since US 401 was, the bypass around Rollsville was constructed, and the town of Rollsville wanted to reevaluate how their main street is being used and look at more multimodal opportunities, including bicycle and pedestrian in particular. And then with transit service starting up to the town, they're really interested in kind of reclaiming their main street. So that was another study we did as a non-core function study. The idea for doing that study actually came out of the original Northeast area study, and then they submitted a project request to us when we were developing our UPWP, and we were able to partner with them and fund that study. And they've actually submitted a few projects from that study into our LAP program and gotten them funded as well. So you can see there's just a variety of special studies that we do that are ongoing and help to inform what that MTP is going to look like and what transportation projects we're trying to deliver. Another example of one of our special studies is our recent commuter corridor study. We just completed this one last year. This was a lot of kind of model work and what-ifing on the transportation network. We had 5 or 6 different scenarios that we looked at that were each different kind of landscapes for what could happen with the transportation network. The idea for that study came through a conversation at one of our executive board meetings where we were updating our MTP and we were showing congestion maps, future congestion maps, and the board said, well, we're doing all of this investment in transportation and we're still seeing an awful lot of red on this map. What do we need to do to make that go away? And so we came up with a variety of scenarios, and spoiler alert, we cannot make the congestion go away, no matter what we do. So we did find that having a balance of investment through different transit projects and different bicycle projects, and being able to really diversify our transportation investment has the best shot at decreasing some of that congestion, but there is still a lot of investment needed on the highway network because we're such a growing region. No, there's no kind of one solution will fix all of that issue. This was a really interesting study, and I would encourage you to go look at it on our website. We have some kind of straightforward project sheets. There's a picture of one on the screen there, but there's a lot of good information in there, and we'll be rolling some of that out through our public engagement for the MTP in the coming months as well. Again, with our TIP, you can see there's a web link here at the bottom of the screen where you can link to the map of our TIP projects. The TIP mirrors the state TIP. That's a requirement. If the state TIP and the MPO's TIP do not match, then projects using federal funding in there cannot move forward. So that's kind of one of the levers the MPO has to be able to assert authority with making decisions in transportation project programming. We're currently developing the 2023 to 2032 TIP, and we're currently operating under the 2020 to 2029 TIP. Again, that's a document that gets updated every 2 years, and it's now a 10-year document. It used to be a 7-year document, but I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago now, DOT expanded it to be a 10-year document, of which the first 5 years are considered to be committed projects. So if you get through the spot process and your project is included in the first 5 years of the TIP, it's considered to be committed, and it will be done, and it can't be reprogrammed or reprioritized, which is an issue that some projects across the state have had, where they've just been kind of serially bumped back and bumped back and bumped back in subsequent TIP versions. Now we're saying if you're in the first 5 years of the TIP, you're a committed project, and that's not going to happen. The Unified Planning Work Program, just a little more information there. I think Chris mentioned earlier we have both our core mission work tasks and our non-core mission work tasks. We develop the UPWP annually in the fall. We have a call for projects that happens at the same time as the LAP call for projects, so typically from August through October. And we ask our member governments to submit project ideas to us, and those can either be considered core project ideas or non-core project ideas. And the non-core typically will require some level of local match in the form of funding in order to be able to program those in the UPWP. The core mission tasks are things like those large corridor studies, our large area studies that I mentioned. Those are all considered core mission tasks because those are really carrying the lift of the work to make the MTP happen. Those non-core mission tasks also will develop MTP projects, but maybe for a more localized or specific area. For our fiscal year 21 UPWP, which will take effect beginning July 1 this summer, we will continue all of our core programs that we do, including our LAP, our Locally Administered Projects program, our TIP and MTP, completing work and continuing work on developing and evolving our travel demand model, doing public engagement around both just MTP work and the MPO work at large, and of course the Wake Transit program, of which the MPO has been assigned several responsibilities to carry that planning work forward. We do have a couple of special studies that are underway this current fiscal year that will continue into the next fiscal year, one of those being the Triangle Bikeway Implementation Study. We're about to kick that off and kind of figure out what the kickoff to that will look like here under the new normal. We're working on that right now. The Northeast Area Study, as I mentioned, just recently kicked off, and the Wake Transit program has a couple of planning studies underway, one of those being a web visualization interface, which will be kind of a mapping dashboard type web interface that will be able to more easily communicate what those investments that we're making through Wake Transit are. And then the Wake Transit Vision Plan update. The original Wake Transit Vision Plan was completed to assume what was going to happen through 2027. And so in order to align that with our MTP, we're going ahead and updating the Wake Transit Vision Plan update to coincide with the horizon years in our MTP so that we can more easily plug that Wake Transit element into our MTP. I mentioned a couple of these special studies that will start up in fiscal year 2021. We're currently conducting a Raleigh to Fayetteville passenger rail feasibility study that we're calling Phase 1. That's really just looking at the market and the possibility, infrastructure-wise, as to whether some sort of passenger rail, be it commuter rail or intercity rail, can be delivered between Raleigh and Fayetteville if it makes sense to even look at delivering something like that. That Phase 1 study will wrap up here this summer by June 30th, and we're expecting the outcomes of that study to determine whether a Phase 2 is necessary. So we've gone ahead and programmed the Phase 2 under the assumption that a little more work is going to be needed to make a call on that. I mentioned the US 401 corridor study that will be in the southern part of our planning area from Lillington north to Raleigh along US 401. A Western Wake traffic signal system integration project, which is going to look at kind of a how-to manual on integrating some of the signal systems out in the Morrisville, Cary, Apex Western Wake area, and hopefully that work will lead to a kind of best practices manual that will be able to be replicated elsewhere in the region and across the state as far as how to best integrate these signal systems to make those function more efficiently. Again, I mentioned the Triangle Bus on Shoulder System study that we're going to be starting up. We also have included language in our UPWP to look at more land use and transportation development evaluation, which we will do through some of these other special studies that are underway to help our local governments better inform how they're tying together these land use and transportation development projects so that we can make sure we're making efficient use of our system and making land use decisions that are supportive of the transportation vision that we have for the region. Also, we will begin working on our CAMPO strategic plan update. Chris mentioned kind of at the top of the training about our boundary changes that happen after the census. We're expecting at least some boundary change after this census, so that's going to be a big focus on our strategic plan update. We try to update the strategic plan every 4 to 5 years just to make sure that the MPO is still headed in the direction that our members want it to head in, make sure our special studies are targeting the things we want them to target, that our membership is getting the services that they need and desire from the MPO staff. So again, that work will start in earnest in fiscal year 2021, and hopefully many of you will be involved in that effort as well. But the point here is mainly that we do a wide variety of planning work that leads into our MTP, and any special study requests or ideas that you all have locally, we're always open to discussing those with you and figuring out how we can help leverage some of the MPO resource that we have to be able to help you with some of your local planning work. Our UPWP also contains our annual budget. We are federally funded at 80%, which means we have a 20% member share match. That comes out to about 60 cents per capita for fiscal year 21. That's only slightly higher than our fiscal year 20 per capita member share budget. Again, that budget includes some partnerships with other organizations such as the Durham Chapel Hill Carborough MPO, Go Triangle, the Fayetteville MPO, and NCDOT in order to fund some of those special projects that we're planning on taking on. It also assumes the Wake Transit funding that is programmed through the Wake Transit Work Plan. And we also include in there our overhead for the lead planning agency, which is the City of Raleigh. CAMPO is housed within the City of Raleigh Department of Transportation, although we operate kind of as a separate entity within that organization. Our MPO self-certification is something that's also included in our UPWP, and that is a required questionnaire that we have that the federal government or FHWA gives us to make sure that we are following all the federal rules and regulations when it comes to metropolitan planning. And every year we answer how we're doing each of those things, and that questionnaire is available in Appendix C of our UPWP every year. So in addition to that, we have several other MPO programs that are kind of constantly running in the background. Our travel demand model, which is the workhorse of the forecasting efforts here at the MPO. We do have a regional travel demand model. We have staff on board here. The Durham Chapel Hill Carborough have staff on board. And NCDOT contributes some staff time to overseeing this model. This is what we use to do forecasting and figure out what our trips are going to look like in the future, what our congestion is going to look like in the future, and what problems we're going to need to solve. We also do the Transportation Demand Management Program. We fund this, again, jointly with the DCHC MPO and the NCDOT. This is a program that has efforts towards reducing single occupancy vehicle commutes. Triangle J Council of Governments runs this program for us. We fund it with some of our CMAQ, or Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality funding that we get. And they work with different local governments and different business entities to encourage alternative forms of commute. So we're seeing a lot of those alternative forms of commute happen, you know, right now with some of this shutdown going on with the viruses and a lot of people working from home. And I think it's going to lend a lot of good information to what is possible here in the realm of TDM in the future. Also, Vision Zero, which is kind of a global effort to reducing traffic fatalities to zero. And that's not obviously not going to reduce every single traffic fatality to zero, but it's trying to prevent the avoidable ones, the ones that are avoidable through design of intersections, through safe lighting, through adequate pedestrian facilities and access. So the MPO has been supportive of that, and we have Vision Zero principles incorporated into lots of our planning studies. Safe routes to schools is something we've been active with. That is there's a committee that meets every month, or every other month at this point, I think. We've had some grant funding that goes towards doing pilot programs at several individual schools throughout the planning area. We've incorporated safe routes to schools work into some of our larger area studies and certainly into some of the smaller corridor level studies, just to look at being able to encourage and enable students to be able to walk or bike safely to school. Our congestion management process, this is kind of a behemoth of a thing, managing congestion throughout the entirety of the triangle. But we get at this through several kind of appendage efforts, including things like our freight study that we recently completed that has recommendations for how freight should travel through, and just our general MTP work in reducing congestions. We run or staff the US 1 Corridor Council of Planning. This is an organization that came about from a recommendation in the US 1 Corridor Study, the US 1 North Corridor Study, which goes from 540 all the way up to the Franklin County line to the north. This is a consortium of staff from all of the local government jurisdictions and NCDOT and Go Triangle along that corridor, and they review development as it comes into play along the US 1 corridor to ensure that that development is not jeopardizing the ability to implement the US 1 freeway project. So since that organization has been formed and been active, that US 1 North project, at least part of it, has actually been funded. And so we're seeing the work of that committee come to fruition because a lot of right-of-way has been preserved and access has been predetermined for some of the new developments that have come in along that corridor, so that it makes the implementation of that freeway project, quote unquote, easier. We also have an MPO public participation plan that is available on our website, and it outlines sort of how the public and our stakeholder agencies can plug into what we do, and when things will go before the board, and when things will be done at a staff level, and when things will be available for public comment and for how long. So it's a good resource for anybody looking for any particular effort to see what the public engagement part of that might be. So we also have other funding mechanisms that the MPO participates in. One of those is SPOT, which is the statewide prioritization effort that is run by NCDOT. We have a lot of robust information coming up on that here in just a minute. And then our locally administered projects program. You may recall several slides ago, Chris mentioned that being a TMA, or a transportation management area, we get additional funding That additional funding is what we use to fund our LAP program, or part of it is what we use to fund our LAP program, where we run a competitive process for member agencies to be able to leverage MPO resources to deliver necessary transportation projects across all modes across the region. And we're going to get into a little more of that information in a few minutes as well. We have a specific training for the LAP program that is required if you're going to both apply. If you're going to apply for LAP funds, you have to attend the application training. And if you receive LAP funds through that competitive call, you have to attend a project management training. So the LAP program, we're going to touch on it here, but it does have its own very robust very robust training program all on its own. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris to go through some of this information on SPOT, unless we have any questions.
Any questions so far on any of the things that Shelby was talking about? Doesn't look like it. So we'll keep going right along. The statewide prioritization process, also known as the SPOT process, is the competitive selection process used by North Carolina Department of Transportation to inform the development of the statewide transportation improvement program. The STIP is again, the state's equivalent to our TIP. And just to give you an idea of of what this looks like, there in the 2020 to 2029 statewide transportation improvement program, what we have up on the screen here is a modal breakdown of the funding that's included in that. So 77% went to highways, 1% to public transit, 3% to rail, 14% for bike ped, and so on. This would include both new construction, but also operations and maintenance funding as well. What we've done over the years is to try and keep track of where the money in the STIP and where the money actually goes. And so this map, which is commonly referred to as the goalpost map, is an effort that we've had ongoing here at Campo to look at where the actual money that is spent, not just programmed, by county goes, and compare that to a variety of other factors, trying to get at where the gas tax funding came from. Because of the way the state collects the gas tax, it's sort of done at the distributor level, not at the point of sale. We have to estimate a lot of things, and so we always put a caveat on this, but it is a pretty robust effort to go and look at what's the sort of rate of return on gas tax generation versus where money goes. And I will point out that on here, the two really tall green areas, both at the coast and in the mountains, it needs to be noted that, the locations where roads are built are not all equal. So there tends to be a lot more bridging that happens in the east and a lot of rock that you got to deal with in the west. So, the per mile cost of a road is different throughout the state. But this is just meant to give you an idea and to give us an idea of what that rate of return is. For years and years, North Carolina had been considered a donor state. And so what that was they looked at how much of the federal gas tax was generated in North Carolina that went up to the federal level, and then how much federal transportation funding came back to our state. And again, for years and years, we got less back than what was generated in North Carolina. And so this effort was really just to do that within the state at the county level. And you can see most of the Campo counties there historically have been in, less than 100% rate of return. In other words, donor counties, if you will. But we do continue to update this over time. And this is from really the beginning of, well, this is from 1999 to 2018. We actually have it back all the way to 1991, I think. And it shows a very similar pattern. So we try to keep this updated for the last 10 years, and that rolls forward every year or two when we update this. So how we get to a STIP, that begins with the statewide prioritization process. And I'll walk you through a little bit of the history of SPOT and then through our specific process here at Campo. SPOT actually began in 2009, and it is continually updated to help it evolve and to meet the needs of developing the STIP, which happens every 2 years. And so over time, they've added additional quantitative methods for the non-highway modes. They always had that for the highway mode, but they've added those in for the non-highway modes. They've expanded the criteria based on stakeholder input. The STI law, the Strategic Transportation Investment Law, which created statewide prioritization, was enacted after the Prioritization 1.0, really during the 2.0 process, and fully implemented for the third round, what is known as SPOT 3. It continues to be updated. Again, every 2 years, there's a statewide work group that's been established to help guide changes and updates to that process. The MPOs have 4 representatives for that, or 3 representatives, excuse me, for that process, as do the RPOs and other stakeholders like the Metro Mayors Coalition, the League the Association of County Commissioners, and so on. And so currently we're in the 6th round of that process known as SPOT 6.0. And all SPOT is, again, is a quantitative needs-based approach to identifying statewide transportation needs. It is the first step towards implementing that or developing that STIP. And from the MPO perspective, each MPO is able to submit a certain number of projects into that process. Those projects are then scored by NCDOT, and then each MPO, RPO, and division engineer are asked to assign local input points to the projects that are within our region. And you can see the web link there to take you to all kinds of information about the Strategic Transportation Investment Law. You can actually see a copy of it and, a breakdown of the current criteria. So how it works is they have categorized the transportation system into 3 different levels, what's known as statewide mobility, which is that highest level, and those are things that are, think of those as the highest order projects and pieces of the network. Using roadway as the example, statewide mobility includes things like the interstate system and most of the U.S. highway network, and then toll roads. And that takes up about 40% of available STI funding is there. That is 100% data-driven. So it's based on the criteria, the quantitative criteria that are used. Those projects are programmed. Other than inputting the projects and selecting projects to submit, there's no further local input into the score of the project. The next level in this, which gets about 30% of the overall funding, is known as regional impact. And those are focused on improving connectivity within the different regions of the state. So the state has been broken up into 7 regions. At that level, 70% of the project score is based on the quantitative data, and 30% is based on those local input points. These include on the roadway system things like the NC highway system. So those that have the diamond shields on them as you're driving around the state. The U.S. highways that would not be included initially in the statewide mobility category would also be at that level. There's also transit that's included at this level. that with certain qualifications. Rail is included in this, as well as at the statewide mobility level, depending on whether it's a Class 1 railroad or not. And then some airports are included at all three of these levels that you see on the screen. And then the third sort of level there is what's known as division needs, and these are based on those NCDOT geographic divisions. And these are the focus of this level is for those local needs. 50% of a project score comes from the technical score, and 50% of the score comes from a combination of MPO and or RPO and division engineer input. The way that this system also works is it allows what's called cascading. So if an interstate project, for example, does not get selected for funding in the blue category, that highest level, statewide mobility, it could compete in the middle category, the green one, and if it doesn't score well enough to get funding at that level, it could compete at the lowest level, division needs. Each MPO, RPO, and division engineer are required to have adopted methodologies for their process for spot. Ours has a provision that does not guarantee automatic cascading of those higher level projects to the next level down. It's by executive board decision that a project could be cascaded down to the next level. And that's for a couple of reasons. Primarily to ensure that a larger, more expensive project doesn't take up all of the funding at a lower level where it's more limited in what types of facilities could use that funding. And generally, what we have found is, particularly with those statewide mobility level projects, if they had just missed the cut for funding at that level, it's likely that they would be funded in the next round of spot, which would be 2 years later. So as we step through this, each MPO, like CAMPO, really has three things it's got to do. It's got to select projects to submit into the process. For CAMPO, we can submit up to 44 projects per transportation mode. So we can submit 44 roadway projects, 44 transit projects, and so on, across all the different modes of transportation. And then the projects get scored by the system at NCDOT. The next thing we do at the regional and division levels of this process is to assign our local input points. We have 2,500 points at the regional and 2,500 points at the division needs level to assign to the various projects that we have. And then the third thing that happens in the process is ultimately we develop and adopt our TIP, which, again, as Shelby mentioned, has to match the state transportation improvement program and vice versa. So how do we do this? How does this process work for us? For roadway projects, you'll kind of see what we have here up on the screen. Again, we can submit 44 projects per mode. We have an adopted methodology that the executive board has adopted and adopted a couple of updates over time. But using the roadway example up on the screen, what we do is we take any of the projects that are already funded in the TIP and the STIP, and we remove them from our consideration because they're funded and committed. The projects that are already in that database at NCDOT and that we do not have to resubmit, we take those out of our consideration too. They're already in the system. We don't have to think about those at this step. For the remaining projects, the first rule is it's got to be in our regional plan, in our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. The statewide prioritization process is one of the main ways that we implement our adopted plan. And so we look at a variety of metrics for our MTP roadway projects, things like delay, overall travel time, some of the socioeconomic growth that we're anticipating over the next, say, 10 years in the region, to compare projects across a variety of different other categories. So we look at, a comparison of sort of what we know is committed to be built versus what hasn't been built yet but is planned. We look across the 3 different decades that are in our plan. We also look at things like network connectivity. We look at the impact of smaller operational improvements or standalone interchange projects. And then we also look at intelligent transportation system projects, things like signal systems, managed motorways, that sort of thing. We also have a step in our process where we coordinate with our division engineers and our neighboring MPOs and RPOs to maximize the number of submittals maximize the submittals we have for our projects. So as an example, in prior rounds of SPOT, we may have had a project where we had it on our list to submit, but a division engineer, say Division 5 engineer, Joey Hopkins, said, well, we would like to, we were thinking about submitting that project too. Then we'll coordinate with them, maybe they submit it, and then we pick another project to submit. And overall, CAMPO got a couple extra projects submitted for our region that increases the likelihood of something getting funded. So where we're at today is sort of approaching that 3rd bullet on the screen. We have a list of candidate projects out for public and agency review and comment. I will tell you that is a living document, and I believe mid last week there was an update to that document that included a couple of additional potential project submissions that were requested by the public and specifically by the town of Cary. There was a grade separation of the railroad that they had asked to add into the submittal candidate list for consideration. Currently, we're scheduled to have a public hearing on April 15th and approval by the executive board of the final recommended list for submission, and that would be for all modes. We would then submit all of those projects into the database that NCDOT has, known as Spot Online, no later than May 1st. That deadline has not changed yet, so we will continue to move forward with this schedule. If that deadline does change, then we would look at what that does to our scheduled process. And then there's also the ability at the regional and division level, if you can get everyone else in those regions and divisions to agree to it, to have slightly different weights to criteria. So in the main line, the across the state criteria, you might have congestion as 30% of the score. If you can get everyone within within your region or your division to agree to it, all the other MPOs, RPOs, and division engineers, then you can modify that, and you might want congestion to be 40% or 20%. And if everyone agrees to that, then at those scoring levels, they will honor that. I will tell you that over the 5 previous rounds of SPOT, we have done this within 2 of our 3 divisions that we work in, and in both of our regions, Region A and Region C, that cover CAMPO. And it's been to our benefit to do that. So the main thing here on this slide is to note that there is they have their sort of 2-year schedule. The yellow boxes on there are when CAMPO is taking one of those steps that we talked about. Step 1, step 2, submission of projects, the local input points. So our project submission, again, right now will be completed by the end of April. And then next spring would be our first opportunity to assign the regional level local input points, followed by the summer, early fall for the division needs level local input points. And then the final step in all that process, step 3, is when we would adopt our TIP and the state would adopt their STIP, which currently is scheduled for June of 2022. So how the next steps in our methodology work is once a project is submitted and it has its technical score, we look at maximizing our funding potential across and trying to find the best overall benefit to our transportation network. So we try to limit or avoid wasted effort, right? So the way to think about that is with this handy-dandy illustration. If you have a project denoted on the slide here by the yellow A, B, C, D, that scores really, really high and scores higher than high enough that you don't need to assign any of the local input points, we won't. The local input points are not a sign of your local support for a project here. Submitting the project was the sign of the local support. So similarly, if we have projects that score really, really low, and no matter how many local input points you might put on them, it will not bring the score up to a level where it could be funded, then we won't put local input points on that either. The MPO won't assign points to those projects either, because those would be, again, wasted effort in this particular round of spot. What we try to do is find those projects that their technical score puts them in a range where our local input points could put them above the funding level. If you think of, we call it the red line. And that enables those projects to make it into the running for potential programming into the TIP and the STIP. So another way to look at this would be, sort of on this chart here. Think of all of those dots as transportation projects, and those are their scores, okay? The blue projects are CAMPO projects. The gray projects are our competition. In this particular example, we've identified that, where we think the funding level will be. So any projects that score higher than 40 are potentially able to get funding. And so we'll look at all of our projects based on their technical score, and if it's above 40, we won't do anything. If it's below 40, down around, say, 10 or 20, our local input points might not be enough to raise them above that red line and make them, very competitive for funding. So what we try to do is look at the ones that are just below the red line that we can impact the project score enough to get it above that red line, okay? And the goal isn't to only focus on what might be our number one or number two priority in the region. The goal is to say, of our top 44 projects that we've submitted, if we get, 10 of those funded or 20 of those funded, whether they're number one or number 40, then we claim that there's some success there. And we try again the next time to get those other ones funded. In the past, we've been successful with this approach in maximizing the number and coverage of the projects that we get funded in our region. And underlying this strategy is that the recognition that no one individual transportation project will be able to solve all of our transportation issues and meet all of our transportation needs in our region. So once those projects have been scored and we've assigned our input points, those projects begin to be put, in order into the STIP, but lots of other things impact the programming and the development of the TIP and the STIP. There are certain rules about how much funding can be spent in certain areas and on certain types of projects. That factors into it. The amount of time it would take to, existing projects that are already funded in the TIP, that comes into play on how much money is available. And then also how much time it takes to design a project and get it ready to actually go to construction. That's important too. And so a couple of things to think about here. Various funding categories like CMAQ or STP, BGDA that we've already talked about, as well as other types of funding from the federal level, local funds that are contributed to a project and available state funding all contribute to the development of that TIP programming exercise. But one of the biggest things that impacts when a project actually gets funded is the project development influence. And so on the slide here, you can see on the left-hand side, that column shows you just an example set of spot scores. And then each row here is a theoretical project. And then what it shows you going across the columns is you know, a 10-year time frame. And so what you can see here is that project at the top that scored 80, the highest, they would look to try and program that first. But then they say, well, this is a big project. There's no design on it. There's no environmental permitting done on it yet. So they have to go through a project development process that includes, you know, doing a NEPA study, doing design, acquiring the property needed for the project, and then constructing the project. So even though it scored the highest, its construction isn't programmed until year 9 in this example. If you look down the list there a little bit, halfway down you can see the project that scored 70. Let's say it's just a smaller project that's, you know, maybe it's adding a signal to a roadway, to an intersection, or adding turn lanes or something. That has a very, very short project development time frame, and that might get funded in the first year, even though it scored lower. And then you can see the other examples there, you know, where the project that scored 75, it took 4 years to get to construction. The project that scored 60 took 8 years. So score is important to get it into consideration for the TIP and the STIP, but then there's lots of other things that impact when that might get programmed in the TIP and the STIP. The funding regions that we talked about and the divisions that we talked about can be seen on this map. So the division needs divisions, that level of spot, correspond to the NCDOT geographic divisions, 1 through 14. The regions correspond to pairings of two NCDOT divisions. So for example, Region A includes all of NCDOT Division 1 and 4. Region C includes Divisions 5 and 6. So CAMPO, to remind you all, it includes part of NCDOT Divisions 4, 5, and 6. So we have projects that compete in several different categories of spot. In Divisions 4, 5, and 6, in Regions A and C, and then in the statewide mobility category. And so there, you know, the way we kind of describe the spot process and the programming of things is it's sort of like 4-dimensional chess or checkers in how all that works. And it really depends on where your project is and what type of a project it is. So some of these areas, some of these divisions and some of these regions, it's more competitive to get a project funded in them than others. And so what we're going to show you here now is stepping through that. So in this example, looking at Region C, that was the combination of Divisions 5 and 6. In this example, they had a projected 10-year funding level for Region C of $754 million and change. That sounds like a lot. Competing in that category, just in the roadway, were 190 projects were competing for that money. Of those 190, 79 of them were were projects that were geographically in CAMPO. And when we did our process, we determined that we thought 21 of them were potentially competitive. In other words, we looked at putting points on 21 of those 79 projects. And you can see on the bottom right there, when we did that, we calculated the red line score of 62.5. Above that, the bar chart, you can see the 190 roadway projects that were competing for the $750 million in funding equaled $8.1 billion worth of identified need. So you had $8.1 billion worth of ask and $750 million of available budget. Very competitive, okay? It is probably the most competitive region in this entire process. Then another example here at the division level is Division 5. Very similarly here, there were the 10-year budget for Division 5 in this example was about $100 million. There were 177 roadway projects, not to mention all of the other modal projects that would have been competing through here. And of those 177 just roadway projects, CAMPO had 99 projects that were within the CAMPO boundaries in Division 5. Of that, we only thought that 9 were potentially competitive. So the 177 equaled about $5.9 billion worth of requests in funding, competing for $100 million worth of available funding. And you can see on that chart, we calculated the red line at 74.5, so much more competitive because of the lower funding level in Division 5 than in Region C, right? Even though they cover the same county, or some of the same counties, Division 5 is still and has been the most competitive pot of funding in the spot process, and we suspect it will continue to be that way long into the future. So the current TIP and STIP, the 2020 through 2029, has been impacted by the funding situation at NCDOT, particularly the cash flow at NCDOT. We've had some projects delayed because of this, where they have even suspended preliminary engineering and project development activities. We've had several projects that have begun to have work start back up, and we anticipate several more would be starting back up into the spring and summer. It is unclear what the current COVID-19 situation might do to those schedules, but as information becomes available and known, then we'll update things. There's a web link here where you can see a regularly updated list of the projects that are suspended. And that list changes from week to week. So you might look on there one week and see a project you're interested in listed, and then the next week it might not be on that list. They might have begun work. Although we've had a few projects that have come off of the suspension list, work has begun again, and then they've gone back on the suspension list. That's rare, but it has happened. Some of the, I guess, major highlights that we have for this current STIP that we're continuing to see work on that currently aren't suspended would be the Complete 540 project. So that has been let. It's a design build project, and that will continue the 540 outer loop from NC 55 in Holly Springs through southern Wake County over to I-40 near the Wake and Johnston County lines by the Clayton Bypass. Also, managed motorways, which I think we talk a little bit more about this later, but managed motorways are a technology improvement project that better uses the capacity we have on our freeway system through technology, through ramp metering, through lane and speed management in the corridors. And it has seen great success in places like Australia and to a degree in the United Kingdom as well. And then one of the other big projects we have that was funded for the first time in the current TIP and STIP is the bus rapid transit corridor from Morrisville through Cary and Raleigh and Garner to Clayton. And all three of those all continue through project development and have not been impacted by the cash flow and available cash issues at NCDOT. So the next funding program that we have to talk about with you is the Locally Administered Projects Program, or LAP program. And Gretchen Vetter, our LAP program manager, is participating via WebEx. So hopefully she will be able to unmute her, and you'll be able to listen to her instead of me for a little while here. If that doesn't work, then I'll jump back on and I'll carry us through the slides. Gretchen, are you able to? Good, perfect.
Yes, I'm here. Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes. We hear you.
All right,
we
great.
hear you fine.
Well, awesome. Okay, well, again, this is Gretchen Vetter, and I am the LAP program manager for Campo. So LAP is a funding program that is managed and administrated through CAMPO, and it is how we prioritize the funding that is directly designated for our region. So Chris and Shelby mentioned these funding sources before, but what we're talking about is that STPDA funding, TAP, and then also the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, or CMAQ funding. So this program was created by the direction of the CAMPO Executive Board in 2011, and that was to create a technically sound and equitable method of funding prioritization. And so two of the major tenets of this program were to create a holistic approach to identifying and prioritizing small but effective projects, and avoiding future federal rescissions to the maximum extent possible. And for those of you who are not familiar with what a rescission is, it is essentially an act of either Congress or from the federal government that says, you know, okay, we designated this funding to you for transportation over the past few years, and if you all don't spend it, we're going to take that funding back. So through this program, we're trying to prioritize projects that are highly effective, that are ready to go, so that we can get working on those projects, and we can keep our money and the feds don't need to take that back from us. All right, and then if you go to the next slide, please. All right, so let's go over quickly how we administer this program. So LAP is managed through an annual call for projects. So this call for projects has a quantitative scoring criteria. We fund all modes of transportation, so roadway, bike, ped, and transit, and all of those projects compete against each other. And if they are funded, they are implemented by the member jurisdiction that submits the project. So that's what the locally administered stands for in Locally Administered Projects Program. So before we open a call for projects, CAMPO staff works with the LAP steering committee to touch base on the project prioritization that we use, so the scoring system that we use, the administration of the program, go over any type of changes or improvements that we would recommend for the next call for projects. Towards the end of the call for projects, we have another committee that reviews the submitted projects and provides a recommendation for funding. And then lastly, the LAP steering committee establishes an annual guide for modal investment, which is also called the target modal investment mix. So you can see that here on the left for the federal fiscal year 21 call for projects. And so this target modal mix is adopted each year before the call for projects is released, and it indicates how our priorities should be distributed between our modes. So it's essentially guiding our investment. So after the call for projects closes and the selection panel meets and reviews the projects that were submitted and their scores, they're going to use this target modal investment mix to recommend the projects for funding, and it's guided by these percentages. So for FY21, we had 65% roadway, 8% transit, and 27% bike ped. And we programmed $25 million for this call for projects. And so the quantitative scoring criteria that we use does have multiple factors in it. Some factors that come into play are the local priority. So these are points that the applicants or the member jurisdictions submitting the projects, they get to enter in those points for their projects. MTP compliance. So we give priority to projects that are earlier in the MTP since we want to get projects on the ground quickly, we give priority to those that are in earlier years of the MTP other than later. Prior agency funding levels. So this is a way to sort of control geographic equity and distribution throughout the LAP program. So this is done on a per capita basis, and member jurisdictions that have not received as much LAP funding in the past benefit from that and get additional points for that lower amount of funding they've received. Project effectiveness and cost effectiveness are both significant parts of the score in which we are measuring the merit of the projects that are submitted. So we're looking at the current problem that the project is hoping to mitigate and then what the project is trying to do to mitigate that. So that is project effectiveness. All right, and then we can go to the next slide. All right, so the federal fiscal year 2021 LAP program was adopted by our executive board last month. So on the screen here, we are seeing the target modal investment mix for federal fiscal year 21, and then what was ultimately recommended and approved. So one thing to point out on here is that the target modal investment mix is that it's a target. And so while the selection panel uses the investment or the target investment mix to recommend funding, and they generally stay within those guidelines, it can vary, and that's based on, you know, how projects fall out. Usually they'll recommend funding a whole project instead of just part of a project in order to get to that that total target funding line. And it also depends on the quality and the quantity of projects that are submitted. So if one year we got a bunch of bike head projects that all had really high scores that were clustered towards each other at the top, and maybe another mode had only a few projects submitted, or maybe there were a few really high scoring projects in a different mode and then the rest of them fell off as far as scoring, the selection panel would review that and they might recommend veering from the target mix slightly in order to prioritize those high scoring projects. But regardless of what the selection panel recommends, their recommendation is presented to the TCC and the executive board as information. It's also released for public comment, and we have a public hearing, and the executive board formally adopts the investment mix for a given call for projects. So the CAMPO executive board has the final say on what projects are adopted. All right, and next slide, please. All right. So here we can sort of see the schedule for a given call for projects. So as you can see from federal fiscal year 21, we just wrapped up and adopted those projects. So now we are starting on federal fiscal year 2022. So in the spring of this year, we have our LAP committee who will meet and provide any recommendations to change any technical aspects of the LAP program, as well as the target modal mix. We actually met last week with the LAP steering committee. And then in the summer, after these recommendations have been released, they will be out for public comment, where the executive board will review these criteria and changes as well. In August, our LAP call for projects opens, usually at the executive board meeting. They will formally open that call for projects as well as the UPWP call, and that call for projects will remain open through October. And then after the call for projects closes, CAMPO staff internally, we work to review and validate all of the criteria that has been submitted for consideration. And then after CAMPO staff validates that criteria, they sit down with the selection committee who ultimately reviews those quantitative scores and provides a recommendation for funding for that fiscal year. So that recommendation is introduced to the TCC and executive board and to the public, usually starting in January. It remains open for public comment through February, and then in February, the executive board is asked to formally approve that recommended list of funding. So that's sort of the life cycle of a call for projects, starting in the spring and then ending in January, February with an approved list of projects. All right, and I think that's all we have as far as LAP.
And we're back.
All right, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you got some nice snacks during the break. This is Brett Martin. I'm the Wake Transit Program Manager with CAMPO, and I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the Wake Transit Plan and associated implementation. And I'm going to go through these slides rather quickly and be relatively brief, but if there are any questions, then I'll take those at the end of my slides, or really anytime following the meeting, because I'm here and always available. So just let me know. But really what I'm going to cover is just what we're, going back to the Wake Transit Plan, which is ultimately what this is all based on, some of the elements that were in that plan, the funding sources that we work with, the governance structure for implementation of the plan, CAMPO's role in that governance structure and in the implementation of the plan, and then local involvement. So the Wake County Transit Plan was developed back in 2015 and ultimately was adopted in 2016. And when the transit plan was adopted, many of you may remember on the general election ballot back in 2016, there was a question to Wake County voters on whether or not they wanted to tax themselves at 0.5% sales tax to fund public transportation expansion in the county. And the majority of voters said yes, and so that sales tax passed, and collections began really in early 2017 on all purchases, not all purchases, some purchases were exempt, but on a lot of purchases in Wake County. But the Wake Transit Plan that went along with that sales tax, it was really a financially constrained vision that ran through 2027. It was considered to be a 10-year vision, and it did not really have a specific implementation element, and I'll get to that later. But the sales tax that I just mentioned was the primary funding source for implementing the Wake County Transit Plan. And the Wake County Transit Plan, when it was adopted, it contained 4 big areas of investment focus, which are termed by the plan to be 4 big moves. And these include connecting the region, connecting all Wake County communities, providing frequent, reliable urban mobility, and enhancing access to transit. And I'll go through what each of those really mean and what's involved with each of those. So connecting regionally, really what was included under this big move, or this big area of investment focus, was commuter rail connectivity between Durham County and Wake County. And so on the graphic here you see, this is definitely not to scale, but you see connectivity of commuter rail between Duke University and Garner. And then, of course, it acknowledged in the plan that there would be an option for future expansion to Alamance County and then into Johnston County. And as many of you know, we've been studying this, and we're heading into kind of we're coming out of an alternatives analysis phase now and heading into a phase where we're going to be starting early project development activities along this corridor. Another investment identified in the plan under the Connect Regionally Big Move was regional express services, inter-county regional express services between Orange and Durham counties and Wake County. One thing you'll see in here is the Durham-Orange Light Rail is still on the graphic. That project has been discontinued, so this is just a graphic from the original Wake Transit Plan in 2016, so I don't want anybody to think that that's happening. The frequent, reliable urban mobility big move, or big area of investment focus, includes the bus rapid transit corridor investments that you hear us talking about a lot, and expansion of the local frequent bus network, which, when we talk about the local frequent bus network, we're talking about service that is provided at frequencies of 15 minutes or less all day. So it includes frequency improvements, but it also includes span improvements to cover larger portions of the day and even additional days beyond just the weekday. Before Wake Transit became a thing, before this funding source, this additional funding source was adopted in 2016, there were only really a couple of routes in Wake County that hit the frequency that we're talking about. and those were limited to very specific times of the day. And so this is a really large improvement over what existed before that funding source became available. Another thing that plays into this overall is not only are we talking about service improvements, we're also talking about major improvements to infrastructure that provides access to transit, such as bus stop improvement, transit centers, transfer points, and that sort of thing. So moving on, the Connect All Communities big move. One of the things I want to note here is the plan says connect all Wake County communities, and Valerie Jordan, who's a North Carolina Board of Transportation member, brought it to my attention that we shouldn't call these communities when we're really talking about municipalities, because municipalities and communities are not the same thing, and I agree with her. So what we're really talking about here is connecting all Wake County municipalities. And before Wake Transit, before this funding source became available, all of the municipalities in Wake County were connected by fixed route transit, with the exception of Rollsville and Holly Springs. And other communities did have, while they had service, that service was very limited to constrained spans and lower frequencies of service. And so the plan calls for new service to both Rollsville and Holly Springs, and for span and frequency improvement, particularly for regional inter-community services. And then the last big move, but not to be underestimated, is the enhanced access to transit. And under this, you'll find what you hear us refer to as the Community Funding Area Program, which allows the communities outside of Raleigh and Cary, including, and included in that is also Research Triangle Park, to leverage match dollars for community-centric or municipal-centric services, or augmentation of services in municipalities that are already planned. So you'll see that on this map, you'll see all of the communities that are identified by the original Wake Transit Plan as eligible for the Community Funding Area Program. Another part of this big move is augmentation of rural or non-urbanized area demand response trips for human service transportation purposes, as well as for the general public. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, and you'll see more of this to come in slides to come, is the original Wake Transit Plan did not have an implementation element. I mentioned it was really mostly just a financially constrained vision through 2027. And so in the first couple of years since the Wake Transit Plan was adopted, the first couple of years of implementation was really putting together what we would call the implementation element of the plan, which involved a number of different things that you've heard us talk about that have come to the MPO, that the MPO board has approved, including a Wake County bus plan, community funding area program management plan, a major investment study to do alternatives analysis for the BRT corridors and the commuter rail corridor, a staffing plan, and an overarching Wake Transit implementation public engagement policy. So now I'm going to just kind of get into what are we talking about in terms of funding here, and what is the magnitude of funding. We are now heading into our fourth full year of implementation, FY21. Our first full year of implementation was fiscal year 18. And what you see here is from the draft fiscal year 21 Wake Transit Work Plan, which is, the annual work plan is the annual budget for transit investments that are funded by the tax, the sales tax. But one of the things I want to point out here are there's a number of funding sources, not just the sales tax, that go into the mix here. There's a half-cent sales tax, and you see how much, with the draft plan we were projecting to come in. We might need to revise this because economic conditions are changing. But you see that is the majority of the source of revenue that we get to assume in our investment authorizations for the upcoming year. There's a small piece of vehicle rental tax that's levied for transit purposes included in that, a $7 vehicle registration tax that was levied by the county that's included in that, and then a $3 vehicle registration tax that was levied by Go Triangle as the Regional Public Transportation Authority included in that. And then you also see other sources that come into that, such as federal and state sources, fares that are wrapped back into the revenue equation, debt proceeds, other transit provider contributions, and then heading into 21, we are starting to make use of funding that was set aside in the earlier years in capital fund balance to bring forward and actually put on large capital projects that we are planning to implement in FY21. So you see some of that being carried forward and added to the equation as well. Overall, right now in the FY21 draft work plan, about $113.5 million of this is coming from those levied transit tax sources that I mentioned. Moving on here, when the Wake County Transit Plan was completed and adopted in 2016, there was a corresponding governance structure to address implementation that was developed to, and this was institutionalized through an interlocal agreement, which included as parties Campo, Wake County, and Go Triangle. And the interlocal agreement and subsequent lead agency assignments that were adopted by Campo and Go Triangle also laid out some functional responsibilities for these three agencies. And so under each, you'll see what their responsibilities are. But one of the big things that you'll note, and I hate that I can't use those laser when I have a graphic up here, but basically the governance ILA set Campo and Go Triangle up to into a bicameral decision-making structure for things that authorize funding that make use of the transit tax sources that I mentioned, or things that inform the authorization of spending against those transit tax sources. So that's a big part of the governance structure. Both Campo and Go Triangle have to take action. They both, when it comes to authorizing funding for specific purposes under the Wake Transit Program, they're both seeing the same things and taking actions at roughly the same time. But ultimately, the roles of each agency, irrespective of that, for Campo are generally long-range planning, we'll say mid and long-range planning, mid-range programming, coordination, and approval of the annual budget, which I already mentioned. And on the Go Triangle side, they're also involved in probably more short to mid-range planning. They have a regulatory role in overseeing the funding, the tax funding is used. There's a financial role. Go Triangle deals with all the financial aspects of the funding and the expenditures against that funding. They also approve the annual budget, and they handle all of the reporting, programmatic reporting that's handled on a quarterly basis and annual basis for all Wake Transit funded stuff. Wake County in the governance ILA has been assigned as the overall arbitrator and as a strong advisory participant through participation on the Transit Planning Advisory Committee, which I'll get to next, in directing and steering the implementation processes forward. Now, one thing I want to mention is because there's a bicameral decision-making structure that we're working with, there is the possibility for decision-making to get locked up, because it is possible, although it's never happened, and we're hoping it doesn't, it actually never happened, that the Triangle Board and the Campo Board do not agree on something that authorizes funding, or on something that it's really just on that work plan that I was talking about, the mechanism that authorizes funding for a program of expenditures. But there's a provision in there for a conference committee to be assembled to reconcile differences in board decisions to unlock that gridlock, should it occur. Moving on in the overall governance structure for implementation of the plan, the governance ILA also created the Wake County Transit Planning Advisory Committee, or the TPAC. And this group, it's a 22-member staff-level technical committee that's very similar to the Campo TCC, except that it's not just making recommendations to Campo, it's also making recommendations to the Go Triangle Board of Trustees. And the focus of this group is really programmatic rather than project level in nature. It's more focused on the coordination of multiple projects as part of a full program, rather than making decisions and focusing on intra-project decisions or decisions that are internal to projects. So that's a big distinction in role here. There are other processes, there are other mechanisms set up to deal with intra-project decision-making, but that's not the TPAC's role. The biggest thing that the TPAC does every year is it develops the annual work plan that I mentioned, which that includes the annual budget. It includes mid-range programming. It includes updates to revenue assumptions, other financial model updates that we have to make so that we make sure that we're staying abreast of any changes that we need to make, in response to changing conditions relative to revenue and expenditures. Another important thing to point out about the TPAC is the TPAC is a very, very busy and involved group. This is a very busy, very large program to implement, and as a result of that, the TPAC currently has 4 subcommittees that really dive into specific details on things that the TPAC as a whole doesn't really have the bandwidth to dive into. That ultimately is filtered up to the TPAC for the TPAC to make recommendations to those boards that I mentioned. Okay? Oh, one last thing. If it isn't obvious, the TPAC is staffed by CAMPO. So CAMPO staff, we have a TPAC administrator. That's one of the 3 Wake Transit staff that Chris mentioned earlier, is a TPAC administrator that handles all of the TPAC's proceedings and the subcommittee's proceedings, and manages how all of that's coordinated and rolls up to ultimately stay on track to implement the Wake County Transit Plan. And that person, the TPAC administrator, is Stephanie Plantich here at CAMPO. So this slide is really just to show the relationship between the TPAC, the governing boards, and representative members on both the TPAC and those governing boards. And the structure is basically set up so that the boards can pass down implementation goals and objectives to the TPAC and its representative members. So the boards are doing that and kind of giving the TPAC and those that are represented on the TPAC direction on, okay, this is where we generally want to go, put together more detailed technical recommendations that get at advancing that. And so then the TPAC takes those and does just that, develops technical recommendations for the board with the input of the agencies represented on the TPAC, as well as those agencies represented on the 2 governing boards. And so moving on, I talked a lot about the annual work plan. And that is the biggest thing that we do in Wake Transit. It's the biggest thing that the TPAC does. It's the biggest thing in Wake Transit that the governing boards consider and approve on an annual basis. But there are a number of other deliverables and work products that were detailed in the governance ILA that are meant to inform those annual work plans. As I mentioned earlier, there was no implementation element of the Wake County Transit Plan. And so these things work to serve that role, so that it can inform ongoing implementation that is institutionalized in those annual work plans. And these include, as I mentioned, the bus plan, MIS, I mentioned earlier, public engagement policy. There's a project prioritization policy that is used as a tool for the multi-year programming that we do. And also it comes in handy if we have revenue shortfalls, or we have a wild swing in revenue in the other direction, and we need to decide what projects really need to have the focus there in whatever year we're moving into. There's also the concurrence framework and concurrence policy as part of this. This is the aspect of the Wake Transit implementation program that deals more with the intra-project decision-making at key milestones throughout project development processes. I mentioned the community funding area program, management plan. Also falling under this is, because we had a 10-year plan, we have to update it frequently and keep sliding out the horizon, which I'll get to later. So the Wake Transit Plan update is also part of this. And then a staffing plan. So let's focus just briefly on what are CAMPO's responsibilities in Wake Transit Plan implementation. I mentioned at a high level, Go Triangle's responsibilities, Wake County's responsibilities, CAMPO's responsibilities earlier. But in all of these bubbles, these are things that have been assigned to CAMPO through either the governance ILA or through lead agency assignments that have been adopted by the CAMPO Executive Board and Go Triangle Board of Trustees. And you'll see annual work plans. CAMPO is responsible for compiling the annual work plan. Go Triangle is responsible for putting together the financial elements of the annual work plan. But CAMPO is responsible for taking all of the aspects of the work plan, which I'll get into all the elements of that in a moment, and pulling it together to make sure it's cohesive and coherent and it makes sense and the public can understand it and all that sort of stuff. CAMPO is also responsible for any updates to the Wake Transit Plan, for multi-year project programming, that you'll see an element of that in the annual work plan when I go through that. We're responsible for administering the community funding area program, administering the concurrence process that I mentioned, administering the project prioritization policy that I mentioned, also making project sponsor designation. CAMPO is responsible for that. And another big aspect of CAMPO's involvement in this is, as I mentioned, TPAC administration. So this slide is, I'm going to get into a few of the big things that I mentioned that are big pieces of Wake Transit Plan implementation. The first being the annual work plan, and I'm going to work from the right to the left on this slide. Every year, the Wake Transit work plan is developed by the TPAC. Really, it's developed by CAMPO and Go Triangle in conjunction with the TPAC as kind of the steering committee for it. And the first place that we start with that is every year we review what our assumptions are for the financial model that drives what revenues we can work with, and some other assumptions about expenditures. And so we're updating our revenue assumptions every year. We're taking another look at and revisiting other assumptions we're making in the financial model. And that basically sets the stage for the other elements that you see to the left that are developed as part of the Wake Transit Work Plan. And there are two areas of emphasis in the Wake Transit Work Plan. There's an operating program and then there's a capital program. And under each of those, and let me just start with those programs. In the annual work plan, just like you'll see in the TIP, it's actually laid out the exact same way as the TIP is that Chris was talking about earlier. You will see multi-year programming of both operating and capital projects. So it will show in there, okay, maybe in FY23, there's a park and ride facility that has design and land acquisition program, and then maybe in 24 you'll see construction. It's that sort of thing that you'll see in the programs, in these two programs, for all of the capital projects and all of the operating projects. And so those two things, the multi-year capital improvement plan, then informs is the annual budget for capital projects for the subject work plan that we're talking about. So we're going into 21, so there's an annual capital budget developed for FY21. There is a budget ordinance that is prepared as part of that Go Triangle ultimately adopts to be in compliance with the Fiscal Control Act. And then there are annual project level funding agreements that go along with the projects that are entered into between the tax district and the individual project sponsors, with CAMPO as a party in many of them for a variety of different reasons. And so that's what you have as part of the work plan for both operating projects and capital projects. And just to go through the process for annual work plan development, the cycle for the annual work plan development actually starts for the upcoming fiscal year. It starts as early as September. And that's when we do basically our call for projects from project sponsors. So they're submitting funding requests for projects during that time. One of the things I want to note is this is not a free-for-all. Because I mentioned that we have that multi-year programming, which was informed by the bus plan that I mentioned, by the MIS that I mentioned, and alternative analysis and project development that has been occurring since the MIS, community funding area program, and all that. We have a good idea of what our investment mix is going to be, or should be, before we go into that year. But what this does is it basically allows all the project sponsors to check, okay, yeah, I'm still doing this, or I need to make a modification, or something else has come up that we need to prioritize higher, or we want to be considered for prioritization higher. than what we already have in the multi-year program. But anyway, we're doing the call for projects in the September-October time frame, and what that leads to is a draft work plan that is ultimately produced and released by the TPAC in the January timeframe. It's then released for public comment for a period of 30 days, generally in the January to March timeframe. We receive whatever public feedback we're going to receive from that, which is really quite a bit. We get a lot of good, Go Triangle does a good job of pushing this out and soliciting input on it, and we get a lot of feedback that we can then take and refine or modify what we have in our draft to react to what the public is telling us they want to see or would be beneficial to them. And so we're taking that information, and then the TPAC members are coordinating to develop a recommended work plan that then is typically comes out and is recommended to the governing boards in the April or May timeframe of every year. And one of the reasons why we have the schedule set up this way is because at the same time we're doing this, our municipal members and local government members are also developing their internal budgets, typically in the January to April timeframe. And so we want to get a draft out for them for their own internal planning purposes so that they can develop their draft budgets heading into the end of the fiscal year so that they have something that authorizes their funding and their expenses for the new fiscal year. Okay, so that's the work plan. Moving on here, another big thing, this is something that's big now because we're doing it now, but I mentioned that the current horizon of the Wake Transit Plan goes through 2027. And, you know, as we're now heading into the fourth full year of implementation, and as you can imagine, as we continue to move through the years of the original 10-year plan, we have to stay apprised of, well, what is going to be our investment mix, and what are going to be our revenues and expenditures for years after that. And so we have to slide out the horizon every so often and plan for those additional years that were added to the horizon. We have decided we're doing the first update to the Wake Transit Plan now. We're going through the process now, but we have decided that this is something that we will be doing every 4 years to correspond well with the MTP update cycle every 4 years that you heard about earlier. And ultimately what this is doing is we're tuning up or kind of reassessing our assumptions and tuning up our assumptions for cost and schedule feasibility for the major capital projects that draw down most of the funding that we have available. And we're extending the horizon by 3 years and looking at, okay, is there some additional investment that we can make in these 3 additional years added to the horizon? And the process that we've set up, the steps that we've set up to go through this well, the first thing I mentioned, the first thing that we really worked on was, okay, we're going to refine or reassess cost and schedule assumptions for those major capital projects. We also need to reassess the transit market every 4 years. Wake County is very, very fast growing. It's rapidly changing. The original Wake Transit Plan used data from 2012, 2013. And now in our update for this round, we're using updated data, and we're already seeing differences. We're already seeing some differences in the transit market from the data that was used for the first plan. So this is very important that we continue to do this. We're also reviewing other regional and sub-regional plans and recommendations from those plans or things that those plans say about transit. A lot of the other work that was mentioned earlier in this training are those things. They have a transit element to them. They were vetted. They were developed and vetted at a regional level with representatives from throughout the region, and so we want those processes to also inform us on the direction perhaps that we should go with any additional remaining financial capacity we might have through those additional 3 years of the horizon. And so we're also doing that. Where we're at right now in the process is we are reevaluating. We're evaluating what financial capacity we have through those 3 additional years of the horizon. one of the things I want to update the group on is we were heading for this kind of having those financial capacity scenarios and heading into our next public touch point with stakeholders and the public in the April to May timeframe. Well, that's obviously not happening now, and so we're going to have to put that off. And so our schedule is shifting a little bit. So at the top here, you should see that should be mid-2020, provided we are able to get out and do what we need to do by June or July as well. And then all of that will lead ultimately to the development and evaluation of investment alternatives for any remaining financial capacity we have for those 3 additional years. And then by late this calendar year, we will look at selecting a preferred or final alternative. The last thing that kind of real focus of CAMPO, kind of big programmatic focus of CAMPO with Wake Transit Plan implementation is the Community Funding Area Program. And as I mentioned, this is the program where all of the municipalities in Wake County and RTP, except for Cary and Raleigh, can leverage matching funds to advance community-centric services, transit services, or augment services that are already planned that might be regional services coming to their communities. So we have had a lot of, since we were able to get this program off the ground, which actually started with the fiscal year 2019, we've had a lot of activity. What it does is it funds planning, operating, and capital projects. And of course, as the program started, we first got, we had a lot of interest in, municipalities exploring what transit services fill the need in their communities best. And so they came in for planning funding through the program. And that included the towns of Apex, Morrisville, Garner, Fuquay-Varina, and Rollsville in the 19 and 20 timeframe. And we've had Wake Forest go ahead, because Wake Forest already had a transit service with its fixed route circulator, came in for funding to do a reverse circulator to do the opposite direction of the same service in Wake Forest, which was also funded in FY20. And for FY21, for our call, we have the towns of Apex and Morrisville have moved forward with operating and capital project applications, which are moving forward for consideration in the fiscal year 21 work plan. And back to the staff, Chris mentioned the 3 Wake Transit staff. The staff person that primarily handles this is Evan Koff. He is our Wake Transit planner. So just to tie everything up here, this is my last slide. Your role in the Wake Transit planning process. Well, everybody in Wake County, all local governments in Wake County are represented on the TPAC and on the governing board some way. And so, as I mentioned, all of the things that we do to authorize funding go through the TPAC and go through those governing boards, and you have representation on those in those arenas. For a lot of the things that inform the annual work plan that I mentioned earlier, like the Wake Bus Plan, the MIS, Community Funding Area Program Management Plan, the Wake Transit Plan Update, we have specialized committees that correspond with those. We often refer to as core technical teams or stakeholder oversight teams, kind of at a higher level, that we have a lot of representation from the local governments, transit providers serving on those to make sure that it's balanced across the region. So we have a number of people from the CAMPO TCC, CAMPO TPAC that are serving in that role for us as well. The traditional transit providers, really kind of their participation in the process, and this is a big part of what they do, is they internally prioritize their projects and their budget development every year. As I mentioned, we do the multi-year programming, but every year they're going back and they're saying, okay, are we ready for this? They're reassessing project readiness. Should we advance this rather than this? They're making those types of decisions. And because part of this is based on priority recommendations in the plans and studies that I mentioned, but a big part of it is also they're having to constantly respond to community demands. They also do, the TPAC's focus and CAMPO's focus is on program level stuff. But they're the transit providers and project sponsors are the ones that are responsible for actually making project level decisions. And so they're doing internal service design, or they're doing service design for their services internally. They're developing and refining technical specifications. They're doing project level public engagement. And then outside of the traditional transit providers, other municipalities in Wake County can participate in Wake Transit Plan implementation through the community funding area program, and then also in the development of regional services. As I mentioned, all Wake County communities are either connected or are planned to be connected, and in the implementation of those regional services, we want all of our partners in those municipalities to be involved in what those look like as they interact with your community. And so that's it. Are there any questions for me before we move into the next phase?
None on the chat. No.
Okay. Thanks, Brad. All right, so that was, I think, a good overview of a lot of material for how the Wake Transit program works and how your communities are and can continue to be involved and successful in that. And I think really the last piece of the training today is to kind of help you all understand how to take your ideas and local priorities and turn them into reality. So we've got a couple of examples here, some small project ideas to reality, and then larger ones as well that we'll step through with you. So whether it's a large or a small project, all the transportation projects that are looking to get funded need to comply with federal and state project development regulations. They need to be, incorporated into our regional plan. They're going to have some level of environmental review done, whether it's under the National Environmental Policy Act or the State Environmental Policy Act, NEPA or SEPA, which is to ensure that, all of those do is that they ensure that the least environmentally damaging alternative, whether that's the natural environment or the human cultural environment, is what moves forward. So with the small projects, typically those are things that are less than $10 million to build. Generally, those are operational or safety improvements. They can be implemented relatively quickly through our LAP program with a local match, or through the TIP program and the SPOT process. Smaller projects are generally included as operational improvements in our MTP and don't require specific action to amend the MTP. Although if it's a smaller widening project, it may require MTP action if it's not already included in the plan, which can take more time, because before you can come in and try and get money through the LAP program or the SPOT statewide prioritization process, you have to get into that project has to be listed in our plan first. So one example of a very quick project actually is the Go Apex Route 1 bus stop improvements. These examples we're going to show you are all real examples, recent examples even. This project constructs bus stops along the town of Apex's first local fixed route bus service route. So the town staff utilized the Wake Transit Community Funding Area program that through Wake Transit that Brett just described a moment ago to develop a plan for a fixed route circulator transit service that runs to a variety of places within the town of Apex. Then the following year after that plan was developed, the town applied for funding through our LAP program to purchase and install everything they need for the bus stops that would support that new route. In this case, they went above the minimum 20% local funding match requirement and actually put 30% funding on the project, and 70% of the project is being funded through federal dollars and our LAP program. In this particular case, using the STBGDA funding source. Another small project example is the White Oak Greenway, MacArthur section. Those of you who are familiar with the White Oak Greenway know that it's a very long greenway. It connects the American Tobacco Trail into Cary and the rest of what's known as the Cross Triangle Trail, which can get you all the way from the American Tobacco Trail into Cary and into Raleigh and over to the Neuse River Greenway. It's also part of the recognized East Coast Greenway. This is another project where the town had done planning, and then a few years later came in through our LAP program and received funding. They actually had a 45% local match on this project to help complete this important gap in the planned Greenway corridor. An even more recent project was are some projects being done in the town of Rolesville. During the fiscal year 2018 work program here at Campo, Rolesville had requested a study of Main Street, which had been US 401 until the bypass was built and opened a few years ago. And so they really wanted to take this opportunity to revision what that Main Street could be and what it could become over time. And so the plan was done during the fiscal year 2018 work program. It was managed by Campo with a lot of participation from the town and the community in the Rolesville area to identify what they wanted it to look like, what they wanted it to feel like, and ultimately help prioritize what the town should go after and implement first for the plan. The town was just recently awarded federal fiscal year 21 LAP funding for implementation of the Burlington Mills Road realignment, which was an intersection project with Main Street. And it's being realigned, which is one of the key components of the Main Street Vision Plan. And then also several other corridor improvements along the corridor, things like sidewalks and pedestrian crossing improvements. And Shelby, I can't remember, did that also include the median in that particular project?
Some median improvements.
Some median improvements there too. So, I mean, a very, very quick hit, less than 3 years, and really from the decision standpoint, 2 years from, completion of their study and identification of discrete projects to try and implement to receiving the funding to implement those projects. So that was a couple of examples of some small projects that really don't take a lot of time once you know what you want to do to be able to implement them. Now for the larger projects, these are typically projects that are greater than $10 million. They're larger regionally significant projects, which means generally a capacity improvement, and they'll require the completion of a full planning and project development process. Generally a higher level of environmental review happens with these types of projects. And they have to, of course, be included in our regional plan, and they must demonstrate that they still conform to air quality standards and that they won't harm air quality standards. These projects, of course, have to be included in the TIP and the state TIP. And generally, these are projects that are getting programmed through the spot process. So these are the bigger widenings that folks are trying to get done, bigger interchange projects, that sort of thing. And so they can take longer to happen, but they can still, happen with. We've had a few success stories of some of these projects getting identified in one of our studies that have been done at the MPO, and then getting funded in the SPOT program within 10 years. So in terms of the transportation timeline, going from idea to reality for one of these larger projects within 10 years is actually moving very, very quickly. Again, if you think back to that slide I showed earlier with, if you have a project that hasn't had any design done on it yet, it may take 2 or 3 years to design the project, a few years to get through the environmental review, a year or two to get the property you need, and then, you know, anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4 years to actually build the project. So even with things moving along and without delays, it can still be anywhere from 5 to 10 years to get through that process for a larger project. So one of the things that we try to do for all of you is make things as straightforward as possible. Sometimes that can be difficult with the various different programs that are out there that all have different rules and regulations. But in an effort to do this, we have what we call the one call for all. And this covers hopefully all of your transportation projects and needs. So each fall, generally late summer, we open the one call for all, and that's your opportunity to submit to Campo if you've got a planning or feasibility study idea that might go into the next fiscal year's work program for the MPO, if you've got a LAP project that you want to submit, or if you've got a bigger project that you want us to be aware of that might go into the next spot cycle. Those are generally, the spot process, again, is every 2 years. So while we'll take any ideas you have every year, we are only doing spot submission project lists every 2 years because that's when they'll accept them. But in particular for the smaller projects and for the studies and feasibility studies, the planning studies and feasibility studies, that's an every year thing. And the next one call for all will likely open up in the middle of August and the submission window will run through the end of October. And then we'll take those things either, and there'll be projects in the LAP program or studies that we would do to determine, you know, what the vision is for a particular area or corridor and identify what projects might implement that vision. And I think we're actually at the end, at least of all of our slides. So I think now would be a good time if we have folks who have questions to feel free to ask them, and we'll try and answer all those questions. And if you are on the WebEx, and you have a computer, it might be best to type them in, and then we can kind of answer them in order. But if you do not, and you just want to ask a question, please feel free to do so.
And we also have staff resources on our website. So any, you know, topic area that you do have questions on, our staff is very accessible and easy to reach by email, particularly these days, if less so by phone. But please do feel free to reach out to any of the MPO staff with any questions that you have after this as well. All right, seeing no questions, thanks everybody for joining us today. I know it was a long haul and a little difficult to do over WebEx, but hopefully you found this informative and were able to follow along and keep up. And the slideshow is posted again to our website if you wanted to review any of the material. And thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time. Take care.